Compression, compression is just basically it's controlling the dynamics of something, right? What a compressor does is it takes the loud sounds, makes them softer, and it takes the soft sounds and makes them louder, right? And why would you need to do something like that? Well, maybe somebody doesn't have good control over their dynamics. Maybe when they're singing something, a really high note, right? They sing that really loud, and then when they're singing a really low note, they sing that too soft. And so, what needs to happen is that, I mean, it's inappropriate. Let's just say. And so what we need to do is control those dynamics. We got to get them to where they're more consistent, right? The other times that you're going to end up seeing this is, for example, in a mix that's really busy. Let's say this is very typical, like for example in country and western, where there's like a lot of instruments going on, fiddle and banjo and mandolin and piano and electric guitars, acoustic guitars, da 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 da, all that kind of stuff. Where like metal, very common. The vocals in those situations are going to get lost, right? They're just going to get lost because there's all this other racket going on, and they're just going to get lost. It's just natural for people to sing, just like I'm talking. Sometimes it's louder, sometimes it's softer. So it's very natural for that to happen. So what'll end up happening is, when anybody does anything that's softer, it'll go away, right? It'll get covered up by the other instruments. And so what you need to do is use a compressor. Now, what you could do is you could actually stick your hand on the fader, and when they sing too soft, you could actually push them up, or when they sing too loud, you can pull them down, right? You could always do that as you're recording, or even you could automate it in Pro Tools to where they you're just gonna turn them up and down as need be, right? But why do that when you have a compressor? Now, by the way, there's this woman by the name of Leslie Ann Jones. She's the chief engineer at Skywalker Ranch, right? You guys can imagine that's a really super nice studio. She's an older lady, and this is something that like older engineers kind of do, older than me, that is. And she does the moving the faders things. She doesn't like the way the compressor changes the sound of. She doesn't like the way the compressor changes the sound of the audio, right? Whatever she's trying to record. She's got a microphone. She's got exactly the right place, just exactly the right microphone. Everything's perfect. Then all of a sudden she goes, "Oh, I need to change the dynamics. The dynamics are too wild, right?" And so, what we're going to do is we're going to put a compressor on there. But then the compressor itself, because of the circuitry, changes, and what it's doing, it changes the sound, the tone, right? She doesn't like that. And so she's going to do it with her hand, right? So sure enough, and she does this while they're tracking, while they're recording the vocals, let's say. And as they're recording the vocals, she's got her hand on the fader. She's learned the song, right? And as they're singing and they get too loud, she pulls them back, right? And then when they're too soft, she pushes them up. I like to think, when I'm thinking about compression, I like to think about Leslie Ann Jones and how she manipulates with the fader and all the controls, the threshold, compression ratio, all that stuff. That's basically mimicking what somebody like her would do with the fader, right? So think about what she's doing, and then relate it to the compressor itself. Before we talk about that, I'm going to show you some pictures of some compressors, some very famous compressors. Let me go back to this guy right here. Here we go. Famous compressors. Here we go. Let me move that over here. This is an LA2A. Universal Audio LA2A, right? This is called an optical compressor. Let me grab something right quick. I didn't find it. Anyway, this is actually very simple. It works really well. It's a very old. It's a very old design. It's a Western Electric circuit that this guy by the name of Bill Putnam, who actually started Universal Audio, believe it or not. This is probably back in the 1940s, and then into the 50s, right? So he designed this thing. This thing here is interesting. Let me see if I can describe how it works, right? The way this works is the sound of somebody's, say, vocals comes into the compressor. And let's say they've got a lot of dynamics and you have to control that. What's going to end up happening is the sound comes into the compressor. Let's say it's Hillary Duff. And the sound's coming into the compressor, right? The sound, once it gets into the compressor, is duplicated, right? The original sound continues on through the compressor, and it goes through, it goes through a resistor, right? And then as it goes through the resistor, it goes out of the compressor so you can patch it into something else, right? So that's the original sound. The duplicate actually runs up, and because remember, this woman's voice is actually electricity at this point, right? And so the duplicate is electricity. It goes up and drives a light bulb, right? So electricity makes a light bulb turn on and off, right? Or glow brighter and softer, right? And so what ends up happening is, as she gets louder, she starts singing too loud, right? Again, you're going to adjust it, but when she sings too loud, what'll end up happening is the light bulb lights up and burns bright. And it shines down on this resistor. Now, this resistor is a light-sensitive resistor, believe it or not. And when light shines on it, it becomes less resistive, meaning it allows less electricity to pass through it. So it's kind of cool. The louder she sings, the brighter the bulb burns, the more resistive the light-sensitive resistor is, the less electricity comes out. It's kind of cool, right? So it's almost completely automatic. It's kind of interesting, right? So that's what this is, an electrical. This is an optical compressor. Now there is an amplifier on the back end of this, and this is all vacuum tubes, kind of like I was showing you in the guitar amp, right? It uses basically the same tubes that the guitar amp uses, right? And so if we look at the controls here, peak reduction, all they just mean is compression, right? The more you turn that up, the brighter that light bulb will end up shining, right? And then once you've got that going on, you just turn this up to make the regular volume just kind of be up to match everything else, and you're good to go. Super automatic, super easy to use. So when you're actually doing compression and you're pressed for time, like for example, you're tracking a band and you're going to throw a compressor on something, you don't want a compressor like we've got over in control room A. We've got that distressor in there. It's got a gazillion knobs and a bunch of buttons you can push. That's not the one you want to use when you're tracking a band. You want to use something that's simple and easy to use and is very effective, right? So that's the LA2A. Super famous, probably the most well-known and loved compressor from the 1940s all the way to now. Bill Putnam actually died, and he originally only made these for himself, but he passed away. Well, he made them for himself, and then people loved them so much that they got him to start producing them, and he started selling them to people, right? Well, he died, and all of a sudden these compressors go super expensive on eBay and Pro Audio Marketplace, places like that, and all of a sudden it's vintage. Everybody wants one, right? Got super expensive. Well, his two sons resurrected Universal Audio, and they resurrected the drawings of his dad, and so they started producing them again, like in the I think it was the mid 2000s. They started producing these again. You can buy these now. They're exactly the way the old vintage ones are, and they sound fantastic. They work on pretty much anything, right? Especially vocals and bass, right? So there's that guy. Let me show you this guy here. Ooh. Here's another Bill Putnam one. This is an 1176. And this is sort of what the distressor is kind of trying to mimic. So this is 1176. This is kind of an interesting box. I've got a software emulation of this, which I'll show you how to work. This is really important. You learn how to use the LA2E and this guy right here, both of them, because every studio has one. Any good studio is going to have one, at least one, if not like 3 or 4 of these guys. Same thing. Bill Putnam invented this in the 60s and 70s, and then he passed away. They become vintage. Super expensive for a while, and then his sons dug out the designs, and now they're producing. The Universal Audio produces these again. Right? Fantastic compressor. Again, back in the sort of like the vintage. Here we go. Let me find. Here we go. Come on. Vintage. This is a Neve 2254. These guys were originally part of a console, kind of like those EQs, like the 1073 EQ and the 1081 EQ. These were actually built into a mixing console. They're really designed for broadcast, but they sounded great on a lot of different things. Anyway, this is a old school, very vintage compressor, right? Fantastic sounding. Rupert Neve then, once he was done with that, he actually he designed with this guy here. Once he figured out that everybody loved a 2254 that was built into the console, he goes, well, I can sell those. And so he made some modifications and made this thing here that you could actually then just buy from him, right? This is the 33609. Fantastic compressor. And it's got all the typical controls, threshold, recovery, ratio, blah, blah, blah. We'll talk more about that here in a second, but there it is. Again, really more designed for broadcast, for radio stations more than anything. Right? It sounds great. Neve is still making this. They don't make the 2254 anymore, but AMS Neve, not Rupert Neve Designs, but the old school, the AMS Neve still makes this guy. You can still buy it. Now, those are very expensive. Those are super expensive. You can, if you want to, you can buy this guy here. Oop, no, not that one. This guy, right, this one right here. This guy is a 500 series version of the 2254. So this is like the 2264 500 series, right? And it fits in a rack. It's like $900. Now you're thinking $900, that's really expensive. Well, $900 is less expensive than a $6,000 2254. And it's less expensive than a $4,000 33609. It's like $900. It goes in the 500 series, and these actually sound really, really good. Fantastic. Here we go. Let's take a look at some other super famous compressors, vintage. Here we go. This is a Fairchild. This is a stereo. This is a 670. They make a mono version called the 660, or they made, I should say. No one makes these anymore. They're really they're very expensive to replicate nowadays, right? Just because of the parts and all that kind of stuff. People are making some replicas, but this is the deal right here. These are, again, classic compressors from back in the day, like the 50s and the 1960s, right? On Beatles records, on Pink Floyd records, on all that old stuff, right? Classic rock stuff. They sound really good. And there's not a whole lot of control. There's all these this is the recovery where it says time constant. That was the recovery or the release time control. And they were set. And so you didn't really adjust. All you had to do is click it, and if it didn't work, you went to the other one. You clicked on the other number. They kind of did it for you, right? Look at that stuff. Look at that in there, man. Again, all vacuum tubes. This is all vacuum tubes. Oh, by the way, the Neves, those are FET. Same thing with the 1176. Those are FET, field effect transistors. instead of using a light bulb and a like the LA2A, a light bulb with a photoresistor, they use a field effect transistor to actually accomplish the same thing, right? This one here uses a vacuum tube to accomplish this. So instead of a light bulb and a photoresistor, it uses a vacuum tube. The duplicate drives a thing called what they call a variable mu. Anyway, it's kind of like the light bulb, right? And sounds super phenomenal. And all of these compressors have their own sound. They sound. They definitely put a sound on. So if you're like Leslie Ann Jones and you work really hard on a sound, making it sound exactly the way it should be, then all of a sudden you throw it in a compressor and you want it to sound exactly the way this is not the thing. None of those actually do that. These all have a very unique sound. They impose their sound on whatever it is you got, right? Take it or leave it, and that's the way it is, right? And then here's a CL1B. This is a modern compressor. This is an optical one, but it has some controls that you don't typically see on an optical compressor. But again, everything that I'm showing you here, if you can, you want to try to learn how to use them. I know it's hard even for me to have to actually go to a studio to use any of these, but you want to learn, you want an internship where they have all this stuff, right? And there's definitely there's plenty of studios in Austin that have all this kind of gear. So you want to get an internship at a studio that you can actually learn how to use this stuff, right? By the way, there's software emulations of all of this stuff. Even though they don't sound the same, they kind of work the same. And so if you have ability to get the software emulations, you can learn how to use them that way, right? That way when you step into your internship, you're good to go. So again, this is very transparent. So this would be more something that Leslie Ann Jones might like. It definitely has a sound, but not nearly as imposing as those other compressors, right? There we go. And then let's take a look at some compressors that we have at school. This guy right here. This is the Dakin compressor. You've probably seen this somewhere. This one here is very this is pretty transparent. So this would be a Leslie Ann Jones one. Yeah, this one actually you don't really hear too much of the compressor working. It's pretty transparent. It actually controls the dynamics without doing too much to it, right? There we go. Notice these time constants. These are all you click on them, right? Whenever we can get back to the studio, let's say the summer or something like that, when you adjust this knob, you'll know that these knobs are all detented. They're clicks, right? They're not infinitely adjustable, right? These are release times. Here, it mimics the release time of the Neve 33609. This one mimics the release time of a Compex, which is a famous compressor. It was the compressor that was used for When the Levee Breaks, the Led Zeppelin tune on the drums, right? And then Fairchild 5 and 6, it mimics the Fairchild that I showed you earlier, right? This is a pretty good compressor. And let's take a look at this guy right here. Here we go. This is a DBX 160X. We have one in A and B, N and B, right? Again, this is actually a very good compressor. It's not very forgiving, right? So you have to be super careful with it. If you can ruin your sound, if you don't adjust it properly. You have to be super careful, right? Threshold, compression ratio, output gain. We'll talk about more over easy. The over easy is a DBX thing, right? There we go. But this one's pretty simple to use. And here is probably the best deal in pro audio right here. This is the RNC, FMR Audio RNC 1773. This one's super easy to use. It's really cheap. It sounds amazing. It's crazy that it sounds as good as it does. It's less than $200, and it sounds every bit as good as like a $3,000, $4,000 compressor. Incredible, amazing. This is designed by Mark McQuilkin. He's the guy that started FMR Audio. He has a PhD in electrical engineering. He was working for Motorola. Both he and his wife, they were both working for Motorola, making a ton of money, but they both love audio, and so they decided to start an audio company, FMR Audio, and this was their first product, the super nice compressor. At the time when he came up with this thing here, Mark McQuilkin was ACC's Audio 3 teacher. I replaced him, right? Big shoes to fill, but he had to quit teaching at ACC because these got so popular, and he was selling so many of them. He had to produce so many of them. He even had his children in the workshop building these guys. He couldn't keep teaching and run his company at the same time. Super phenomenal. They're really easy to use. The way you set this thing here to where it works, it'll work pretty much on like 99.9% on everything. Excuse me. And the adjustments you made is exactly the way you see it. If you take all the knobs and put them at noon, at 12 o'clock noon, it'll all sound great. It's crazy. He designed it that way. Oh, the one thing you do have to push is the super nice button. This is a very aggressive compressor. When the super nice button is not on, it's very aggressive, and the sound that it makes is very imposing sound, right? You click into super nice, completely transparent, and it works just like as you see it right there with the knob straight ahead, straight up. Fantastic. Less than $200. If you want an analog compressor, by the way, one of the things that digital doesn't do very well is analog compression. It just doesn't work quite as well as digital doesn't work quite as well as analog, right? But if you wanted to buy an analog compressor that's fantastic sounding, that everybody's going to love, this is the one to get. That's like $185 or something like that. Something super cool. There we go. Let's take a look at that one. Let's go back and take a look at this guy. There we go. Ratio. Let's take a look. So let's talk about these controls here, right? So the threshold control, remember, the compressor is going to take loud sounds and turn them down. It's going to make soft sounds louder, right? Again, we're reducing the range between the loud and the soft. We're making the two closer together, right? So the threshold controls how loud something's going to be before the compressor turns it down, right? So you're going to get, again, you're listening, you're going, oh, they're getting too loud at that one spot. So the threshold control goes where it's too loud, right? And that determines when the compressor kicks in, right? As it sits right now, -5 is where it kicks in. Anything louder than -5, the compressor turns it down. Anything less than -5, the compressor doesn't do anything to, right? That's how that works, right? Let's come over here to attack. That's the one I want to talk about. The attack, notice it's in milliseconds on this compressor. It's not always that way, but this is in milliseconds. So what it's saying that, here's what the attack does. The attack determines how long the compressor waits before it kicks in. So at one point, at the threshold, right, at this point here, once the signal goes above -5, the compressor goes, oh, I need to turn it down. But again, the way the attack is set, it's going to wait for 6 milliseconds before the compressor kicks in, right? Now, the reason you want to do that is because what you don't want to do is ruin the front end of a sound like a kick drum or a snare drum or something like that, right? If I were to set this thing at 0.2 milliseconds and ran a kick drum through there, you wouldn't hear doom, you'd hear like boom. you would completely get rid of the hit, right? So on certain things, you've got to make sure that you adjust the attack knob, and you have to allow a little bit of the front end of the front end of the sound to sneak through untouched, and then it can compress, right? So there you go. That's what the attack does, right? Again, this is probably some review for you guys, right? Again, I like to think about Leslie Ann Jones. She's listening to something. She's got her hand on the fader. She's not going to use one of these. She's got her hand on the fader. She's listening. Oh, it's too loud. And then she's going to move that fader, right? There's another knob I want to talk about, and it's not, this one doesn't have one, but there's another knob called the knee knob. And sometimes it's a switch, sometimes it's a knob. The knee determines how quickly, once the compressor starts to turn something down, it determines how quickly it turns it down, right? So you're thinking, well, that's kind of like attack. Well, not quite. The attack determines how long something's going to wait before it turns it down. The knee determines how quickly it turns it down, all right? So again, thinking about Leslie Ann Jones, she goes, oh, it's too loud. She waits a little second, lets the sound sneak through, and then she moves the fader down, right? Now she can either jerk it down really fast, or she can ease the fader down slow, right? That's what the knee knob or the knee switch does. Remember me talking about the DBX, the button called over easy? Well, that's what that does. When the over easy knob is in, it's a soft, what they call a soft knee or a slow knee. When the over easy knob is not engaged, then that's a fast knee, right? Typically the fast knee is for drums, stuff like that. And go on. Good boy. One of the cats. Sorry about that noise. The over easy button is DBX's version of a soft knee. Right? Some compressors have them, some compressors don't. Like that LA2A has two knobs, and that's all you get. Right? This is the only compressor that has a super nice button. Right. So there you go. Let's see here. Then ratio. So the ratio knob, it determines how much something gets turned down. Again, thinking Leslie Ann Jones. She goes, oh, it's too loud, right? I need to turn it down. And she's going to ease it down because she doesn't want to ruin the sound, right? For example, like vocals would be a soft knee, right? Or a slow knee. But she goes, oh, I'm going to turn it down now, right? So she turns it down. How much is she going to turn it down? Is she going to move it way, way down, or is she only going to move it a little bit? Well, what makes her going to move it a lot is whether if they get super loud. If the singer gets super loud all of a sudden, Leslie Ann Jones is going to turn it down a lot. If they only get a little bit loud, she's only going to turn it down a little, right? And so that's what the ratio knob determines, how much it gets turned down, right? So the way I like to think about this, again, these are tips, hints. The way I like to think about it is the worse the singer or the worse the player, the higher the ratio, right? Somebody who's really, really good, has really good control of their dynamics, you might not have to compress them all, or maybe like 1.5 to 1 or maybe 2 to 1. If there's somebody who doesn't have very good control, it's going to be a higher knob, right? Sometimes you see something that says infinity to 1. This compressor doesn't have one, but let me show you. I think it's on this one here, this DBX. There we go. There we go. There it is, infinity to 1. Infinity to 1 is a limiter. By the way, there's that over easy button again, right? Infinity to 1 is a limiter. Now, like a lot of the older engineers, people like Leslie Ann Jones, they use the word compressor and limiter interchangeably, but they're really two different things, right? A compressor controls how loud something is, right? Or how loud something gets, right? It sort of massages, it helps them, right? Like Leslie Ann Jones, she was like a human compressor, right? A limiter, on the other hand, it puts a brick wall, says, okay, I'm setting a limit, you can't get any louder than this no matter what, right? Infinity to 1, right? So what do these numbers mean, right? The number, it's a ratio, right? So if you look at 2 to 1 right there, what that really means, if there's a change in volume, right? If there's a change in loudness of 2 decibels, and you have that button, if you have this knob on 2 to 1, if there's a change in loudness by 2 decibels, the compressor will turn it into a change in volume of 1 decibel, right? Again, that's not limiting, that's kind of controlling. It's allowing it to get louder, but not as loud, right? Again, a change in loudness of 2 decibels, the compressor will turn it into a change in loudness of 1 decibel, right? Right now it's on 6 to 1, meaning a change in loudness of 6 dB is turned into a change of loudness of 1 decibel, right? That's a lot, right? Even 2 to 1 is a lot. Think about it. It's actually cutting the volume in half, right? 6 to 1 is more like a Hillary Duff kind of thing. I shouldn't be making fun of her, but 2 to 1 would be more like, you know, somebody good. Well, better, let's say, right? The release determines how quickly the compressor comes out of compression, right? So we've been talking here about turning it down, right? So the threshold determines how loud something has to be to make the compressor turn something down. The ratio determines how much it gets turned down. The attack tells it to wait a certain time before it begins to turn it down. The release knob determines how quickly, once it doesn't need to be compressed anymore, the release knob determines how quickly it goes back to normal, right? Again, thinking Leslie Ann Jones, she goes, oh, they don't need compression anymore. She's gonna raise that fader. Now she can jerk it up really fast, or she can ease it up kind of slowly, right? And that's what this thing here determines. Now usually the release time is designed, you want to adjust the release knob so that it releases fast enough to where think about a kick drum, right? Boom, 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 something like that, right? And you need to compress those kick drums. What you want is you want the compressor to come completely out of compression before the next kick drum hits, right? So it'll be boom, and it's released all the way. But again, you don't want it to release super fast, because then the listener will hear that something's being fiddled with, right? They'll hear the compressor turn up really fast, right? So you want it to be slow enough to where it's not noticeable, but then you also want it to be fast enough to where it's not still compressing when the next sound comes back around, right? So usually this is done by tempo, right? So you listen to the BPM of the song, the tempo of the song, and you adjust it that way, right? And then finally we get to the gain knob, right? That determines the gain knob determines how loud, I'm going to say it, how loud the soft stuff is going to be. We've all been talking so far, we've been talking about how the compressor turns it down. The gain knob determines how much it's going to turn it up, the soft stuff, right? Remember, once it falls below, in this particular situation, falls below -5, it's no longer compressing, right? So we've determined what is loud. Loud is above -5, soft is below -5, right? The gain knob determines how loud the soft stuff is going to be, right? All right, good enough. There we go. Well, anyway, so there's a good intro, right? I'll come back with another video here in a second, and I'll have some stuff up for you guys. See you in a sec.